In the summer of 1244, the city of Jerusalem was not expecting an army. It had no walls fit for war, no grand garrison, no sense that history was about to return with violence. Because everyone believed the age of crusades was fading, they were wrong. This channel tells stories about moments that seemed small at the time but quietly rearranged the future. Not battles of spectacle, but turning points of structured decisions, pressures, and systems colliding until history had no choice but to move. And the destruction of Jerusalem in 1244 was not just another sack. It was the moment the Crusader dream became irreversible fiction. This is not just a story about who captured a city. It is about why the Christian kingdoms of the East would never truly recover again, even before their final defeat. To understand that, you have to step back from the walls and look at the map. By the mid-13th century, the Middle East was not divided into neat Crusader versus Muslim lines. It was a fractured landscape of rival dynasties, mercenary bands, shifting loyalties, and exhausted states. The great Muslim empire built by Saladin had splintered into competing branches of the Ayyubid dynasty. Brothers fought brothers. Nephews plotted against uncles. Cities switched allegiance with pragmatic indifference. Meanwhile, the Crusader states, once aggressive invaders, had become coastal survivors. Their power base had shifted to fortified ports, trade income, and diplomacy. War was expensive. Reinforcements from Europe were unpredictable. Survival depended on negotiation as much as swords. In fact, Jerusalem itself had been regained not through conquest but through paperwork. In 1229, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II negotiated the city as returned during the Sixth Crusade without fighting a major battle. It was an extraordinary diplomatic victory and a fragile one. The agreement left Jerusalem largely undefended and surrounded by Muslim-controlled territory. It was less a fortress than a symbolic possession, and symbols are dangerous when no one can defend them. At the same time, a new force had erupted across Asia, the unstoppable expansion of the Mongol Empire. Their conquests shattered kingdoms, displaced populations, and sent shockwaves far beyond the lands they directly ruled. One of their victims had been the once powerful Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia. But empires do not disappear neatly, they fragment. After being crushed by the Mongols, thousands of Khwarezmian soldiers became a nation without a state-hardened cavalryman, with no homeland, no salaries, and no reason to obey anyone except the leader who could promise survival. They became a wandering army, disciplined, experienced, desperate, and therefore extremely useful. Rival Muslim rulers began hiring them as mercenaries, hoping to harness their ferocity without losing control. This was a dangerous gamble. The Khwarezmians were not simply troops, they were displaced conquerors, accustomed to plunder and autonomy. Eventually, they entered the service of the Egyptian Ayyubid Sultan, Asali Ayyub, who was locked in a struggle against his own relatives for dominance of Syria and Palestine. He needed shock troops, they needed a target. Jerusalem lay directly in their path. What happened next was not a carefully planned siege. It was something far more unsettling, a collision between a vulnerable symbol and a stateless army that lived off destruction. In July 1244, Khwarezmian cavalry swept into Palestine with terrifying speed. There was no elaborate encirclement, no drawn-out engineering works, no diplomatic demands. Jerusalem simply could not resist. Its defenses had been neglected for decades. The population included clergy, pilgrims, merchants, and a small Frankish garrison, not a city prepared for a professional assault. When the Khwarezmians arrived, they attacked immediately. Contemporary accounts describe chaos rather than battle. Gates forced, streets filled with mounted warriors. Fires spreading without coordination. The defenders collapsed in hours, not days. But the true horror came afterward. Unlike rulers seeking to govern a city, the Khwarezmians had no intention of administration. They were not building an empire here. They were surviving through plunder. Churches were looted, monasteries burned, sacred relics destroyed or carried off. Massacres swept through neighborhoods with little distinction between combatants and civilians. Even the dead were not spared. Chroniclers describe graves opened and bones scattered, an act less of religious hatred than of pure opportunistic looting for buried valuables. This was not conquest, it was erasure. For the Christian world, the shock was profound. Jerusalem had changed hands before, but this felt different. There had been no grand battle, no heroic last stand, no negotiation. A coalition army formed from the Kingdom of Jerusalem's remaining forces and their allies, attempting to confront the Khwarezmians and their Ayyubid partners. This culminated in the Battle of La Fourbi later that year, one of the largest engagements since the days of Saladin, and it ended in disaster. The coalition army was shattered, thousands killed, many captured. The military backbone of the Crusader states in the region was effectively broken in a single day. After La Fourbe, there would be no realistic chance of reclaiming inland territories by force. The coastal cities would endure for decades, but the idea of a restored Christian kingdom centered on Jerusalem was gone. What makes this moment so significant is not just the violence, but the structural consequences. Before 1244, European rulers could still imagine that another crusade might restore the balance. After 1244, the situation required not just an army, but an entirely new geopolitical reality. The Muslim world, despite its internal divisions, had demonstrated it could mobilize overwhelming force when needed. Meanwhile, Europe was increasingly preoccupied with its own conflicts, dynastic wars, political fragmentation, and economic pressures. Logistics mattered. Distance mattered. Commitment mattered. Jerusalem was simply too far away to save repeatedly. In the years that followed, crusading energy shifted toward defensive efforts and isolated expeditions. None achieved lasting success. Even when European kings arrived in person, they found themselves negotiating rather than conquering. The initiative had permanently changed hands. Ironically, the Khwarezmians themselves did not endure. Their usefulness as mercenaries declined, and they were eventually defeated and absorbed by other powers. They vanished from history almost as suddenly as they had appeared, but the damage they inflicted remained. Jerusalem returned to Muslim control, this time not as a bargaining chip, but as a secured possession. Later rulers would rebuild and repopulate the city, integrating it firmly into the Islamic world. For Christians, pilgrimage would continue, but sovereignty would not. In the long arc of history, the sack of 1244 marks the true end of the Crusader vision. Even though the last Crusader's stronghold would not fall until 1291, empires do not die in a single moment. They fade, then fracture, then suffer a shock that reveals they cannot recover. This was that shock. It exposed how hollow the Crusader presence had become, dependent on diplomacy, trade, and fragile alliances rather than sustainable power. It showed that a stateless army, unleashed by larger geopolitical forces, could accomplish what decades of organized warfare had not, and it demonstrated a harsh truth of medieval politics. Control of sacred places follows control of systems, manpower, resources, geography, and stability, not just faith or courage. In the centuries that followed, Jerusalem would change again, but never in the way medieval Europe once imagined. The era of crusading kingdoms ruling the holy city from afar was over. Not with a grand final siege, not with a decisive heroic defense, but with a sudden brutal sack carried out by soldiers who had lost everything and therefore had nothing to preserve. History often turns not on the ambitions of the powerful, but on the desperation of the displaced. If there is a lesson here, it is that civilizations rarely collapse because their enemies become stronger overnight. They collapse because the structures that once sustained them quietly erode until one unexpected blow reveals the emptiness beneath. The fall of Jerusalem in 1244 was that revelation.